Cold mud sucked at Faye's ruined boots, pulling with a wet, heavy sound every time she shifted her weight. Rain had been falling for 3 days, turning the village square of Oakhaven into a sprawling sty of pig dung, rotting cabbage leaves, and terrified peasants. She kept her chin tucked against her chest, letting the fraying wool of her hood hide her face. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, tasting of copper and hunger. She needed to remain invisible. An unregistered omega in the borderlands was as good as currency, and currency in these parts was usually spent in blood. A low, vibrating rumble rattled the wooden shutters of the tavern to her left. It wasn't thunder. It was a growl pitched so low it vibrated through the soles of her wet boots and settled deep in her molars. Desmond had arrived. He did not ride in on a horse. The Alpha King did not use beasts of burden when he was the most terrifying beast on the continent. He came in his shifted state, a towering 9-foot mass of iron-grey fur-scarred muscle and teeth that looked like shattered flint. The scent of him hit the square before he did. It was suffocating. Ozone-dried blood and centuries of crushing, absolute authority. It made the air feel thick, like trying to breathe underwater. Next to Faye, a blacksmith whimpered, dropping to his knees into a puddle of brown water. Faye followed suit, not out of reverence, but out of sheer survival instinct. The mud seeped through her thin trousers, freezing her kneecaps. Desmond stalked through the kneeling villagers, his massive paws sinking quietly into the muck. He was here for the tithe. 300 years he had ruled this jagged stretch of earth, outliving warlords' rebellions and the very concept of hope. His wolf was an ancient, bitter thing. It killed without passion. It ruled without joy. It was a hollow shell of bone and violence driven only by the momentum of existence. He stopped a few feet from Faye. Faye stopped breathing. She stared at the massive scarred claws planted in the mud, inches from her face. Mud dripped from the coarse hair around his ankles. He smelled like winter. Cold, unforgiving, dead winter. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the instinctual, humiliating whine that bubbled at the back of her throat. Her omega nature was a curse, a biological defect that demanded submission to the apex predator standing over her. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted hot salt. Don't look up. Don't make a sound. Desmond lowered his massive head. The hot draft of his exhalation blasted against her hood. He was smelling her. Not the dirt, not the stale sweat, but the underlying pulse of her biology. Faye braced for the jaws to snap around her neck. She braced for the end. Instead, a sound broke the suffocating silence of the square. Thump. Faye flinched. Thump. Thump. Splash. Slowly against every survival instinct she possessed, Faye tilted her head up. The Alpha King, the nightmare of the Northern Territories, stood completely rigid. His ears were pinned back, his massive chest heaving with erratic, confused breaths, and his tail, a thick, heavy appendage that had severed heads and broken spines in battle, was wagging. It wasn't a subtle twitch. It was a frantic, dog-like wag, sweeping back and forth so hard it slapped against the mud, splattering dirty water onto the faces of the kneeling villagers. Thump, splash, a collective, terrified gasp hitched in the throats of the guards surrounding the square. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. Desmond let out a sound that wasn't a growl, but a sharp, panicked snarl of absolute humiliation. His massive body jerked backward, entirely out of his own control. the wolf dead. Inside for 3 centuries, a phantom limb of instinct was thrashing against his ribs, howling with a violent, ecstatic joy. Mine. He tried to step away, to regain the suffocating aura of terror he had perfected over generations. But his back legs stiffened, and he let out a short, pathetic whine that sounded entirely too much like a starved pup finding a scrap of meat. Faye didn't feel awe. She felt sick. This was worse than death. This was a complication, and complications got you killed. She stared at the monster, her grey eyes locking onto his glowing amber ones. In them, she saw centuries of bloodshed, cold intelligence, and right now, a profound, agonizing embarrassment. With a deafening roar that shattered the tavern's remaining windows, Desmond blurred into motion. He didn't bite her neck. He didn't offer a hand. He clamped his massive jaws around the thick wool of her cloak, lifting her off the ground entirely like a stray kitten, and bolted toward the tree line. Bones rattled against rotting wood. The iron-barred wagon hit another rut in the road, launching Faye upward before gravity slammed her back down onto the splintered floorboards. Her teeth clicked together hard enough to send a sharp ache radiating behind her eyes. She sat in the darkest corner of the cage, knees pulled tight to her chest, shivering violently. The damp wool of her cloak smelled like wet dog and her own sour sweat. Across the cage, sitting on a bench bolted to the iron bars, was Desmond. He was in his human form now. He hadn't shifted back in front of her. He had tossed her into the wagon. With a savage grunt, disappeared behind a copse of dead oaks and returned 10 minutes later wearing a heavy leather riding tunic and trousers that looked thrown on in a rage. He was a large man, too large for the confined space of the wagon, broad-shouldered with a face carved from granite and exhaustion. His dark hair was wet, plastered to his forehead, and his jaw was locked so tight the muscle twitched visibly beneath his pale skin. He hadn't spoken a word in 3 hours. Faye didn't swoon. She didn't find the aggressive silence mysterious or brooding. She found it terrifying. Her wrists burned where rough hemp rope chafed against her skin. While he stared out the slatted window into the passing dark forest, she was busy grinding the side of her right boot against a protruding iron nail in the floorboards. She had a small rusted paring knife hidden in her sock. If she could just tear the leather of the boot slightly, she could reach it. "Stop doing that," Desmond said. His voice was like grinding stones, dry, heavy, lacking any inflection. Faye froze. She didn't look at him. "I'm cold. You're trying to reach whatever piece of garbage you've hidden in your footwear." He finally turned his head. His eyes were human now, a dull, washed-out hazel, but the weight behind them was suffocating. "If you pull a blade on me, I will likely eat it, and then I will lock you in a room without windows. Sit still." "You kidnapped me," she rasped, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it flat. "I claimed you." "I didn't agree to be claimed." Desmond let out a breath that sounded like a tire losing air. He leaned back against the iron bars, rubbing a calloused hand over his face. He looked incredibly tired. "I didn't agree to it either. Yet here we are." The absolute lack of romance in his tone was jarring. There was no possessive growl, no grand declaration of fate. He sounded like a man who had just discovered rot in the floorboards of a house he couldn't afford to rebuild. "Why me?" Faye asked. She smelled her own scent, Anxiety, wet wool, the faint metallic tang of her period approaching. She was not a prize. She had dirt packed deep under her fingernails and a scar that dragged through her left eyebrow, leaving a bald patch. Desmond looked at her for a long time. The wagon swayed the lanterns outside, casting long moving shadows across his exhausted face. "I don't know," he said softly. "My wolf has been dormant since the Great Blight. I assumed it was dead. I preferred it dead. It made ruling simpler, without the noise." He swallowed his Adam's apple, bobbing sharply. "Today you smelled like wet earth and terror, and the beast woke up. It wagged." He said the word like it was a slur. 300 years of establishing absolute dominance, and I wagged my tail like a village mongrel. Faye felt a strange, hysterical laugh bubble in her chest. She choked it down, turning it into a cough. "It isn't funny," he snapped, his voice dropping an octave, the beast suddenly pushing against his vocal cords. "It's a little funny," she whispered, digging her fingernails into her knees. "You took me from my home because your animal got confused." "It isn't confused." Desmond stood up the carriage, rocking under his weight. He crossed the small space in a single stride, looming over her. The scent of pine and raw predatory heat washed over her, making her stomach clench. Her omega instincts screamed at her to bare her throat, to whine, to submit. Instead, Faye gagged. The clashing scents, his overpowering pheromones, the stale straw, her own fear mixed with the violent rocking of the wagon. Her stomach heaved. Desmond recoiled immediately, slamming his back against the opposite bars. "Are you ill?" "I'm seasick," she gasped, clutching her stomach. "And you smell too loud." "I smell too loud." He looked genuinely offended, a crack in the ancient warlord facade. "I am an alpha king. My scent is meant to be intoxicating to your kind. It smells like I'm eating pine needles and chewing on tin foil." She shot back, dry heaving into the damp straw at her feet. Desmond stared at her. The great, terrifying conqueror of the north stood pinned against the wall of his own wagon, completely paralyzed by a shivering, nauseous woman who looked at him with nothing but sheer annoyance. Inside his chest, the wolf whined. It wanted to comfort her. It wanted to nest her in furs and lick her face. Desmond squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his palms against his temples. "Gods above, I hate you," he muttered to his own beast. The stronghold of Hemlock was not a castle from a storybook. It was a brutalist structure of black stone and iron spikes built into the side of a frozen mountain. The wind here didn't howl. It screamed. Faye was placed in a chamber in the upper towers. The guards hadn't dragged her. They had escorted her with a bizarre, terrified reverence. Desmond had disappeared the moment the wagon hit the courtyard, fleeing the carriage, as if Faye were carrying the plague. The room was absurd. Heavy velvet curtains hung over arrow-slit windows. A massive bed, carved from dark wood, dominated the center, piled high with furs that smelled overwhelmingly of Desmond. Faye didn't touch the bed. She sat on the cold stone floor near the hearth, wrapping a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders, staring at the embers. Her stomach gave a hollow, painful cramp. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. The heavy oak door unlatched with a loud clack. Faye flinched her hand instantly, dropping to her boot. She had managed to work the paring knife loose during the ascent to the tower. It was small, dull, and practically useless against a lycanthrope. But it was metal, and it was hers. Desmond walked in. He looked worse than before. He had changed into a simple linen shirt and dark trousers, but there were deep purple bags under his eyes, and he walked with a slight limp, as if fighting his own body's momentum. He carried a wooden tray. He set the tray on a heavy oak table near the door. Steam rose from a clay bowl. "Eat." Faye didn't move. She watched him from her spot on the floor, her eyes flicking from his hands to his face. "Is it poisoned?" Desmond let out a dry, rasping noise that might have been a laugh. "If I wanted you dead, Omega, I would have stepped on you in the mud. It would have saved me a massive headache." He backed away from the table, putting distance between them, and leaned against the cold stone wall, crossing his arms. "It's mutton broth and bread. Eat it." Hunger warred with paranoia. Hunger won. Faye scrambled up from the floor, clutching the blanket around her. She approached the table cautiously, like a stray dog approaching a trap. She didn't sit in the chair. She grabbed the bowl with both hands and lifted it straight to her face, tipping the hot broth into her mouth. It was scalding, but she didn't care. She drank with desperate, ugly gulps, spilling greasy broth down her chin and onto her frayed collar. She grabbed the chunk of dense brown bread and tore into it with her teeth, chewing loudly, eyes darting back to Desmond to ensure he wasn't moving. She expected disgust. She expected the refined aristocratic king to look at her lack of manners with revulsion. When she glanced up, Desmond was staring at her, his eyes entirely black. The human iris had vanished, consumed by the dilated pupil of the beast. His chest was rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. His hands gripped his own biceps so tightly the linen of his shirt was tearing at the seams. He was fighting it. He was fighting the instinct to provide, to hover, to take the food and feed it to her himself. The internal battle was visibly tearing him apart. Blood suddenly welled up on his lower lip, where his elongating canines pierced the flesh. "Stop looking at me like that." Faye snapped her mouth full of bread. Fear spiked in her veins, sharp and cold. "I can't," he ground out. His voice was a guttural scrape of sound. It wants to wipe your chin." Faye paused mid-chew. She stared at him, then hastily wiped her greasy chin with the back of her dirty sleeve. "Tell it to back off." Desmond closed his eyes, his breathing ragged. It has been 300 years in the dark. It is starving Faye. Not for food, for this, for the scent of you eating what I provide. He pushed off the wall. He didn't mean to lunge, but his body moved faster than his exhausted human mind could process. In a fraction of a second, he was across the room, towering over her. His hand reached out, trembling violently, a massive scarred paw aiming for her cheek. Panic blind and feral took over. Faye didn't think. She dropped the bread, her right hand snapping down to her boot. She pulled the rusted paring knife and drove it upward with all her meager strength, aiming for his throat. She missed. The dull blade caught the thick leather cord of a necklace he wore, sliding off and sinking a mere half-inch into the thick meat of his collarbone. Silence slammed into the room. Faye let go of the handle, stumbling backward until she hit the wall. Her chest heaved. She had just stabbed the Alpha King. She was dead. She was going to be flayed alive. Desmond looked down at the tiny wooden-handled knife sticking out of his flesh. A single drop of dark crimson blood welled up around the blade, trailing down his pale skin, soaking into his linen shirt. He looked at the blood. Then he looked at Faye, who was shaking so hard her teeth were audibly clicking. Desmond reached up and casually pulled the knife out. He tossed it onto the table. It clattered against the wood, sounding pathetic. Then Desmond started to laugh. It wasn't a booming, cruel villain's laugh. It was a rusty, broken sound. It sounded like an engine trying to turn over after years of disuse. He slumped into the chair she had abandoned, burying his face in his large hands, his shoulders shaking with dark, cynical amusement. "A cheese knife," he wheezed, looking at her through his fingers. The black had receded from his eyes, leaving them human and tired again. "I conquer the western reaches, I slaughter the warlock kings of the south, and my fated mate greets me by trying to sever my artery with a rusted cheese knife." Faye swallowed hard, pressing her back against the stone wall. Did it hurt? Desmond dropped his hands, looking at her with a raw, imperfect honesty that caught her completely off guard. "Not as much as wagging my tail did," he said quietly. For the first time since the mud of the village square, the heavy, suffocating aura of the predator vanished in the room. He wasn't a king right now, and she wasn't prey. They were just two exhausted, deeply broken people, locked in a cold stone tower, tied together by a biological joke neither of them found particularly funny. Faye looked at the half-eaten bread on the table. She looked at the blood staining his shirt. Slowly, very slowly, she slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor again. "Can I finish my bread?" she asked, her voice small. Desmond didn't move. He just watched her, the tension in his jaw finally relaxing. "Yes, little wolf," he murmured. "Finish your bread." Smoke from the hearth burned the back of Faye's throat, smelling of wet ash and old pine. She chewed the last dense bite of her bread, the crust scraping against her dry palate. Desmond remained in the chair opposite the table. He hadn't touched the wound on his collarbone. The single drop of blood had dried into a dark, flaking crust against his pale skin, the torn edges of his linen shirt stiff with it. He was watching her breathe. It wasn't a casual gaze. His eyes tracked the rise and fall of her chest, the pulse fluttering at the base of her throat. It was the intense, obsessive focus of a starving animal staring through the bars of a cage at a piece of raw meat. "Stop doing that," she rasped, wiping a crumb from her bruised lower lip. Desmond blinked, tearing his gaze away to stare at the stone wall. The heavy muscle of his jaw jumped. "It is difficult. You smell like fear and stale sweat, yet to the beast it is sweeter than fresh marrow. I am adjusting. Adjust faster." Faye pulled her knees to her chest, shivering as a draft cut through the cracks in the stone floor. "What happens now? You drag me here, your wolf wags its tail, and then what? Do I just sit on this floor until I die of old age? You bathe," he stated flatly. He pushed himself up from the chair. His movements were rigid, as if he were actively forcing his skeleton to operate against its own will. He walked to the heavy oak door and slammed his fist against it twice. The wood shuddered. Less than a minute later, the door creaked open. Two older women shuffled in, keeping their eyes glued to the floorboards. They smelled of lye onions and sheer, unfiltered terror. They dragged a heavy copper tub between them, the metal grating horribly against the stone. A third woman followed, carrying two sloshing iron buckets of steaming water. Nobody looked at Faye. They poured the water, set down a block of coarse grey soap, and practically threw themselves back out the door, pulling it shut with a definitive click. Faye stared at the steaming copper tub. The heat radiating from it hit her face, coaxing a miserable ache from her frozen joints. She wanted that heat. She wanted to submerge herself until her bones thawed. But she didn't move. Desmond stood by the door, his arms crossed over his massive chest. "I am not getting in that while you are standing there," Faye said, her voice dropping into a low, defensive gravel. "I have seen naked women before, Omega." "I don't care if you've seen 1,000 naked women," she spat her fingers, tightening around the wool blanket. "I am not stripping for an audience, especially not one whose eyes turn black every time I swallow." Desmond flinched. It was a minuscule movement, just a tightening of the shoulders, but Faye saw it. A flash of profound shame crossed his exhausted face. He looked at the floor, exhaling a long, slow breath through his nose. "I will stand outside," he said quietly. He turned the iron ring of the door handle. "Do not try the window. It is a sheer drop of 300 feet into a gorge of jagged shale." "I'll keep it in mind," she muttered. The door clicked shut. Faye was alone. She didn't waste a second. Dropping the blanket, she peeled off her ruined, mud-caked boots. Her wool socks were stiff with freezing water. Her trousers and tunic felt like a second, heavier layer of dead skin. She stripped them off, kicking them into a heap in the corner, and climbed over the high rim of the copper tub. The water was brutally hot. It scalded her freezing flesh, sending a wave of agonizing pins and needles up her calves and thighs. Faye bit her lip to hold back a whimper, forcing herself to sit down until the water reached her collarbones. It was heaven. It was agony. She grabbed the block of lye soap. It was harsh-smelling purely of rendered fat and ash completely devoid of lavender or rose water. She scrubbed her skin until it turned a bright, angry pink, scraping away the mud of Oakhaven, the grease of the tavern, and the lingering scent of her own terror. She dunked her head under, scrubbing the grit from her scalp, letting the hot water muffle the howling wind outside. When she finally surfaced, gasping for air, a sharp sound froze her in place. Scratch, scratch. Faye stared at the heavy oak door. Whine. It was a pathetic, high-pitched sound. The sound of a massive, lethal predator begging to be let inside. Faye's heart hammered against her ribs. She sank lower into the cooling water, bringing her knees up to her chest. Desmond was out there, or rather the Alpha King was out there, pressing his massive weight against the wood, driven mad by the scent of her washing herself. "Go away," she whispered. The scratching stopped. Heavy booted footsteps retreated down the stone corridor, fading into the ambient howl of the mountain wind. Faye let out a shaky breath, realizing she was gripping the edges of the copper tub so hard her knuckles were white. She climbed out, her wet feet slapping against the freezing stone. Beside the hearth, someone had left a pile of folded garments. They were not fine silks or delicate lace gowns. They were practical, heavy clothes. A thick linen shift, a woolen tunic dyed a deep, dark forest green, and sturdy leather leggings. Faye dried herself roughly with a coarse towel and pulled the clothes on. They fit reasonably well, though the tunic was broad in the shoulders. They smelled neutral. Clean wool, cold air. The door unlatched. Faye spun around, snatching the heavy iron poker from the hearth. Desmond stepped in. He stopped dead, his eyes dropping to the iron poker clutched in her hands. He looked terrible. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and a fresh, jagged scratch ran down his jawline, as if he had clawed at his own face. "Put the iron down, Faye," he said. His voice was a raspy whisper. I am not going to hurt you. Your animal was whining at the door. I know. He closed his eyes, leaning his heavy head back against the thick wooden frame. I had to drag myself down to the lower armory to stop from breaking the hinges. It wants to nest you. It smells the soap, and it wants to roll in it. He opened his eyes, and the sheer absurdity of the statement hung between them. The deadliest warlord in the north wanted to roll in her bathwater like a golden retriever. Faye slowly lowered the iron poker. You are completely unhinged. I am a prisoner to biology, Desmond corrected, grimly pushing away from the doorframe. And you need to learn to mask your scent, or we are both going to end up dead. My court arrives for the winter solstice feast in 2 hours. The great hall of Hemlock was a cavernous, depressing space. The walls were lined with massive tapestries, but they were rotting at the edges, depicting faded battles and slinking wolves woven in dull, oxidized silver threads. A massive fire roared in a hearth the size of a small cottage, spitting thick pine sap and choking smoke into the rafters. Faye walked beside Desmond. She kept her chin tucked, her eyes fixed on the uneven stone floor. The hall was packed with bodies, dozens of them, lycanthropes. The smell hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. It wasn't just wet fur and musk. It was heavy metallic copper, raw meat, aggression, testosterone and territorial rage baked into the very stones. As Desmond entered, a heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the hall. Conversations died in throats. Tankards of ale were lowered to scarred wooden tables. Every pair of eyes, amber gold and piercing yellow, snapped to the Alpha King. Then they shifted to Faye. Faye felt her skin crawl. Her Omega biology flared in a panic, urging her to drop to her knees, to expose her neck, to show she wasn't a threat. Her knees actually buckled slightly. Desmond's hand snapped out, gripping her elbow, in a vice. He didn't look at her. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He just hauled her upright with a brutal yank. Do not cower, he hissed, his voice barely a breath against her ear. If you smell like prey, they will treat you like prey. Walk. He dragged her toward the high table at the front of the hall. It was elevated on a wooden dais overlooking the sea of brutal, scarred warriors. Desmond shoved her into a heavy, carved wooden chair beside his own. Faye gripped the arms of the chair. Her knuckles popped. She stared at the plate in front of her. A massive joint of meat dripping with red, uncoagulated blood sat in the center. A frail thing, isn't she? The voice was a low, rumbling sneer. Faye looked up. A man sat at the end of the high table. He was leaner than Desmond, but wrapped in thick, wiry muscle. Half of his face was covered in a sprawling, shiny burn scar that pulled his left eye into a permanent squint. He was cutting into his own raw meat with a massive hunting knife, not bothering with a fork. Garrick, Desmond rumbled as a warning. The air in the room suddenly grew dense. The atmospheric pressure dropped. Garrick didn't flinch. He leaned forward, stabbing a piece of bloody flesh and bringing it to his mouth, chewing with wet, sloppy sounds. 3 centuries, my king. 3 centuries we wait for the Alpha's mate to appear, expecting a warrior of the bloodlines. And you bring back a stray dog from the mud. She smells of dirt and sickness. Faye felt a flush of hot, prickly shame burn her cheeks. She was dirty. She was nothing. Desmond went entirely still. The hand resting on the table slowly curled into a fist. The thick silver goblet next to his plate groaned the metal warping under the ambient pressure of his rage. "She smells," Desmond said, his voice dropping into a register that made the floorboards vibrate. "Like mine. Do you challenge my nose, Garrick?" Garrick paused mid-chew. He glanced at Desmond, then back at Faye. He smiled a jagged, ugly thing. "No challenge, my king. Just an observation. The north is cold. Weak things tend to freeze." The wolf inside Desmond snapped. It wasn't a calculated move. Desmond didn't stand up. He simply blurred. In a fraction of a second, he was out of his chair, leaning across the heavy oak table. His massive hand locked around Garrick's throat, lifting the beta completely off his chair. The hall erupted in the sound of scraping chairs and low defensive growls. Desmond slammed Garrick backward down onto the table, shattering a platter of roasted root vegetables. His canines had dropped fully elongated, sliding past his bottom lip. His eyes were pure, abyssal black. "She is not weak," Desmond snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "And if you look at her again, I will tear your jaw from your skull and feed it to the crows. Do you understand?" Garrick choked, clawing uselessly at Desmond's forearm. He managed a gurgled sound of submission. Desmond didn't let go. His chest heaved. The beast was fully at the surface, thrashing against its cage. It wanted to kill Garrick. It wanted to rip the throat out of anyone who had looked at its mate with disrespect. Faye saw the muscles in Desmond's back lock. He was going to kill him, right here on the dinner table. And if he did, the fragile political balance of this brutal court would shatter, and she would be the cause. She didn't think about being brave. She thought about surviving. Faye grabbed the heavy, two-pronged iron carving fork from the center of the table. She raised it and slammed it down with all her strength, embedding the tines an inch deep into the thick oak wood right next to Desmond's white-knuckled fist. Thwack! The sound cracked like a whip through the silent hall. Desmond froze. His black eyes slowly slid from Garrick's purple face to the iron fork quivering in the wood, and then to Faye. Faye's chest was rising and falling rapidly. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. She didn't look away. "Your food is getting cold," she said. Her voice cracked, betraying her terror, but the words were loud enough for the hall to hear. Desmond stared at her. For a long, agonizing second, the beast weighed whether to snap at her or obey. Then the black receded from his eyes. He released Garrick's throat with a shove. He slowly sat back down in his chair, reaching out to pull the iron carving fork from the wood. He set it down gently. He didn't look at Garrick, who was coughing violently on the floor. "Eat," Desmond commanded the hall, his voice back to a hollow, exhausted gravel. The tension snapped. Lichens scrambled back to their seats, dropping their heads, tearing into their food with nervous, aggressive energy. Desmond looked down at his own plate. He didn't touch his food. He leaned slightly toward Faye, his voice barely a murmur under the clatter of plates. "Are you trying to get yourself killed, little wolf?" Faye picked up her own knife, her hands still trembling so hard it clinked against her plate. "Are you?" Desmond didn't answer. But underneath the table, hidden from the eyes of his court, his heavy, scarred hand shifted, pressing the back of his knuckles against her thigh. It wasn't a caress. It was an anchor. And for the rest of the meal, he didn't pull it away. The fever hit her around midnight. Faye had been huddled in the massive bed, wrapped in 3 layers of heavy bear furs, but she couldn't get warm. The cold wasn't external. It felt like someone had driven an icicle straight into her bone marrow. Her teeth chattered violently, a machine gun rhythm that echoed in the dark stone room. It was the drop, the biological tethering. She had read about it in illicit, forbidden pamphlets passed around the lower dens. When an unregistered Omega was forced into proximity with an Alpha of immense power, their biology fought to align. The Omega's body literally tried to rewire its own chemistry to match the suffocating gravity of the Alpha. It was painful, humiliating, and incredibly dangerous. If the body failed to adjust, the heart simply gave out under the strain. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes, yet she felt like she was trapped in a frozen lake. She curled into a tight ball, digging her fingernails into her own arms to distract from the deep, hollow ache radiating through her pelvis and spine. A low groan escaped her throat. She clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling the sound. She didn't want him to hear. Desmond was asleep in the chair by the hearth. He had refused to leave the room, claiming the perimeter wasn't secure after the incident with Garrick. He had simply folded his massive frame into the leather armchair, closed his eyes, and gone still. He wasn't still anymore. Faye heard the soft, heavy tread of his boots on the stone. The mattress dipped violently as a massive weight settled onto the edge of the bed. Faye. His voice was rough with sleep and immediate alarm. She couldn't answer. Her jaw was locked tight to keep from shattering her teeth together. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the furs tighter over her head. A large, calloused hand pulled the furs back. The cold air hit her soaked skin, and she let out a pathetic, keening whine. Desmond sucked in a sharp breath. "You are burning up. Your skin is like a furnace, yet you smell like frostbite." "Drop." She stammered the word, slipping past her chattering teeth. My biology." Adjusting. Desmond cursed. It was a filthy, ancient curse that sounded like grinding rocks. "I did not know it would happen this fast. You are too small. The gap in our power is too wide. Your nervous system is fracturing, trying to bridge it." Get away," she gasped. "Your scent, it's too heavy. It's crushing me." Desmond jerked his hand back as if she had burned him. He stood up, backing away from the bed, his chest heaving. The internal contradiction was tearing him apart. His alpha instincts were screaming at him to smother her in his scent, to wrap around her and force her biology to submit to his heat. But her human words were telling him his very presence was killing her. He paced to the hearth, dragging a hand through his dark hair. "I can fetch the healer. I can get herbs to dull the nervous system." No, Faye gasped, rolling onto her back, her spine arching as a brutal cramp seized her abdomen. Too late. Just go to the door. Give me space." Desmond walked to the heavy oak door. He stood with his back to it, as far from the bed as he could get in the chamber. He crossed his arms, his knuckles white. He watched her writhe beneath the furs. 10 minutes passed. It felt like hours. Faye's breathing grew ragged, shallow pants that barely drew oxygen. Her heart rate was erratic, fluttering like a trapped bird against her ribs. The cold was consuming her. She couldn't feel her toes or her fingers. The edges of her vision began to narrow, pulling into a dark tunnel. "Desmond," she whispered. The word barely carried over the crackle of the hearth. He was beside the bed before her lips finished forming the syllable. He fell to his knees on the stone floor, his face level with hers. The panic in his eyes was raw, stripping away the centuries of warlord indifference. I am here. What do you need? Tell me what to do. Faye looked at him. She hated him. She hated his power, his world, the mud he had dragged her from, and the cage he had put her in. But right now, he was a furnace, and she was freezing to death. Hold me. She sobbed, the tears finally breaking loose, hot and humiliating against her icy cheeks. I can't get warm. Please. Desmond didn't hesitate. He didn't strip off his clothes or climb under the furs. He simply reached out and scooped her up furs, and all hauling her out of the bed and pulling her against his chest. He sat down on the cold stone floor, leaning his back against the base of the heavy wooden bed frame. He gathered her into his lap, wrapping his massive arms around her trembling body. He was radiating heat. It was like pressing against a brick oven. The heavy, suffocating scent of ozone and pine washed over her, but this time it wasn't crushing. It was an anchor. Faye buried her face into the crook of his neck, burying her cold nose against his collarbone, right next to the scab where she had stabbed him hours earlier. She pressed her icy hands flat against his chest, feeling the steady thumping rhythm of his massive heart beneath his linen shirt. Desmond rested his chin on the top of her head. He didn't speak. He didn't try to soothe her with hollow words. He just tightened his grip, acting as a physical barricade against the cold. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the violent shivering began to subside. The horrific cramps in her muscles loosened. The raw heat of the alpha was seeping into her marrow, dragging her biology across the chasm, forcing it to align with his. It was an intimate, terrifying submission of her body completely out of her control. "I'm sorry," Desmond whispered into her hair. His voice cracked a rough, broken sound in the dark. "I did not mean for this to happen. I forgot how brutal the tether could be. I forgot everything." Faye didn't answer. She was too exhausted to formulate words. But as she drifted into a heavy, feverish sleep, her fingers unconsciously curled into the fabric of his shirt, anchoring herself to the monster in the dark. Grey light bled through the arrow-slit window, casting long, sharp shadows across the cold stone floor. Faye woke to the smell of old ashes and the deep rhythmic thrum of a heart that was not hers. She lay perfectly still. Her cheek was mashed against a hard collarbone. A thick, muscular arm wrapped securely around her ribs, anchoring her against a chest that radiated furnace-level heat. She was sweating, her hair plastered to her forehead, but the bone-deep agony of the drop had vanished. She tilted her head. Desmond's jaw rested inches from her brow. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the dead hearth. He looked as though he hadn't blinked in hours. Deep purple shadows bruised the skin beneath his eyes, and his lips were pulled into a tight, grim line. "You are awake," he stated. His voice was a dry rasp, thick with exhaustion. "Unfortunately," Faye croaked. Her throat felt like it was coated in sand. She tried to pull away, but the sudden movement sent a wave of nausea rolling through her gut. Her muscles screamed in protest, weak and trembling like overstretched parchment. Desmond immediately loosened his grip, his hands retreating as if she had suddenly turned to hot iron. He shifted backward, leaning against the heavy oak bed frame, putting 2 feet of cold air between them. "Don't move too quickly. Your nervous system is still repairing the fractures." Faye pushed herself up into a sitting position, dragging the heavy bear fur with her and wrapping it tight around her shoulders. She rubbed her face with the back of a shaking hand, wiping away the dried drool from her chin. She glanced at the dark, wet patch she had left on Desmond's linen shirt. "I ruined your shirt. You stabbed my collarbone yesterday," Desmond replied flatly, resting his forearms on his knees. "I consider the drool an improvement in our diplomatic relations." Faye let out a short, breathy sound that might have been a laugh if she had the energy for it. She looked at him, really looked at him. Without the suffocating aura of the Alpha King pressing down on her, he just looked like a profoundly tired man sitting on a dirty floor. "Why didn't you let me die?" she asked. The question wasn't dramatic. It was a genuine inquiry into logistics. It would have severed the bond. You could have gone back to your quiet, miserable existence. Desmond closed his eyes. The muscle in his jaw flexed hard and sharp beneath the pale skin. Because the beast would have followed you into the dirt. If your heart stopped, mine would have torn itself apart, trying to jumpstart yours. We are tethered, Faye, by blood, by scent, by a cruel joke of biology. He opened his eyes, and the washed-out hazel was gone, replaced by the deep, glowing amber of the wolf. But it wasn't the terrifying, abyssal void of a predator. It was warm. It looked at her with a desperate, pathetic reverence. "It doesn't want you dead," Desmond whispered, his voice vibrating with the low timbre of the animal. "It wants to build you a nest of rabbit skins and bring you the skulls of your enemies." Faye stared at the Alpha King of the North. She felt a profound, exhausting headache blooming behind her eyes. "I don't want skulls. I want a cup of water and a weapon." The amber blinked, caught entirely off guard. Slowly, the human returned to Desmond's features, his pupils contracting back to a normal size. He frowned. "A weapon. Garrick is going to try to kill me," Faye said, matter-of-factly pulling her knees to her chest. "If not today, then next week. Your court thinks I'm a stray dog. You made it worse by choking him on the dinner table. If I'm going to survive this tether, I need something better than a rusted cheese knife." Desmond stared at her for a long, quiet moment. The cynicism in her voice, the total lack of romantic delusion, seemed to act as a balm to his frazzled nerves. He didn't offer to protect her. He didn't vow that no one would ever touch her. He knew the brutal reality of his court better than anyone. He pushed himself off the floor, his joints popping audibly in the quiet room. He walked to a heavy, iron-bound chest at the foot of the bed, knelt, and flipped the heavy latches. Rummaging through folds of dark leather and chainmail, he pulled out a long, slender sheath of oiled black leather. He walked back and held it out to her. Faye hesitated, then reached out from beneath the fur. Her cold fingers brushed his as she took the weapon. His skin was rough, calloused, and blistering hot. She pulled the blade free. It wasn't a broadsword or a knight's ceremonial dagger. It was a hunting knife, perfectly balanced, the steel folded and dark to prevent catching the light. The hilt was wrapped in worn, comfortable leather. It was lethal, practical, and devoid of any useless embellishment. "It is Valyrian steel," Desmond said quietly, watching her test the weight in her palm. "It will pierce lichen hide. It will shatter bone. Thank you," she muttered, sliding the blade back into the sheath. She clutched it against her chest, right next to her beating heart. Desmond didn't move away. He stood over her, his massive hands hanging loosely at his sides. The silence stretched thick with the conflicting sense of cold ash morning frost and the sudden sharp tang of ozone. Faye looked up. Desmond's ears, the human ones, were flushed a dull, embarrassing red. His chest was rising and falling in a familiar, erratic pattern. "Don't," Faye warned, her grey eyes narrowing in suspicion. "I cannot stop it," Desmond gritted out, squeezing his eyes shut. His hands balled into tight fists, the knuckles turning white. "You accepted a gift. You accepted my protection." "It's a knife, Desmond, not a marriage proposal." Behind him, brushing against the stone floor with an audible rhythmic sweep, a thick, iron-grey tail materialized from the base of his spine. Thump, thump, thump. It wagged, hard. It swept against the heavy leg of the oak chair, knocking the piece of furniture back an inch with a loud scrape. The sound echoed in the quiet room, a horrific betrayal of the warlord's stoic dignity. Desmond let out a sound of absolute soul-crushing defeat, dropping his face heavily into his hands. "Gods have mercy on me, I am a laughingstock." Faye sat wrapped in her bare fur, clutching her newly acquired lethal dagger, watching the most dangerous creature on the continent wag its tail like a praised hound. The terrifying paralysis was gone, replaced entirely by a strange, cynical pity. And beneath that, buried deep under layers of dirt, trauma, and sheer exhaustion, a tiny, reluctant spark of warmth took hold in her chest. "Just go get the water," she sighed, leaning her head back against the bed frame. Desmond practically fled the room, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind his massive frame. But the scent he left behind in the cold stone chamber no longer smelled like crushing dead winter. It smelled faintly like coming home. If this raw, messy, and deeply imperfect werewolf romance kept you hooked, smash that like button. Right now, Faye and Desmond prove that survival isn't pretty, and true bonds are built on grit, not fairy tales. Subscribe to the channel and share this video with your fellow dark fantasy lovers. Drop a comment below. What would you do if a terrifying Alpha King wagged his tail at you? See you in the next story.